The morning sun cast long shadows across the red sandstone walls of the Grand Canyon as 23-year-old Marcus Thompson stood at the south rim, his weathered leather Bible clutched tightly in his hands. The young man's dark eyes reflected both determination and uncertainty as he gazed into the vast chasm before him. Born and raised in Detroit, Marcus had never seen anything quite like this natural wonder, and the sheer magnitude of God's creation left him speechless. Marcus was the eldest son of Reverend Samuel Thompson, a respected Baptist minister who had built one of Detroit's most influential congregations from the ground up. The Thompson family had always been pillars of their community, known for their unwavering faith and dedication to helping others. But Marcus had been struggling with his calling, questioning whether he was meant to follow in his father's footsteps or forge his own path. The year 1995 had been particularly challenging for the young seminary student. While his younger siblings seemed content with their predetermined roles within the church community, Marcus felt an overwhelming urge to experience God's creation beyond the confines of urban ministry. He had spent months planning this solo retreat to Arizona, much to his father's concern and his mother's tearful protest. "Son, the wilderness can be a dangerous place for those unprepared," Reverend Thompson had warned him during their last conversation before Marcus departed Detroit. "But I understand the need to seek God's voice in solitude. Moses spent 40 days in the wilderness, and Jesus himself withdrew to pray. Marcus had promised to call every few days and return within 2 weeks. He had packed carefully for the journey, bringing camping equipment, enough food for several days, proper hiking gear, and most importantly, his grandfather's Bible, the same one that had guided 3 generations of Thompson men through their spiritual journeys. The Grand Canyon represented more than just a destination for Marcus. It symbolized his desire to strip away the distractions of modern life and connect with the divine in its purest form. He had researched the area extensively, reading about the indigenous peoples who considered this land sacred, the early explorers who had risked everything to map its depths, and the countless visitors who had found spiritual renewal among its ancient walls. As he prepared to descend into the canyon via the Bright Angel Trail, Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The trail was well-maintained and popular among tourists, but he planned to venture beyond the established paths to find the solitude he sought. He had studied topographical maps and spoken with park rangers about safe camping areas and water sources. The weight of expectation from his family and congregation pressed heavily on his shoulders. Everyone assumed he would return from this journey with clarity about his calling, ready to embrace his destiny as the next generation of Thompson ministers. But Marcus wasn't certain that was his path. He loved God deeply, but he questioned whether traditional ministry was how he was meant to serve. His backpack contained everything he needed for survival: water purification tablets, dried food, a sleeping bag rated for desert temperatures, a first aid kit, and emergency signaling equipment. But it was his grandfather's Bible that held the most significance. The worn leather cover bore the marks of decades of faithful study, and its pages contained handwritten notes from both his grandfather and father. As Marcus began his descent into the canyon, the morning air was crisp and clean. Other hikers nodded friendly greetings as they passed, and park rangers reminded everyone about safety protocols and the importance of staying hydrated. The young man felt confident in his preparation and eager to begin his spiritual quest. The trail wound down through layers of geological history, each striation telling the story of millions of years. Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the sense of timelessness and permanence that surrounded him. In Detroit, buildings rose and fell within decades, but here, the rocks had witnessed the birth and death of entire civilizations. He paused frequently to read scripture and reflect on the natural cathedral surrounding him. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a raven or the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. This was exactly what he had hoped to find, a place where he could hear God's voice without the constant noise of urban life. By midday, Marcus had descended several miles into the canyon, leaving behind the crowds of casual day hikers. The temperature had risen significantly, and he was grateful for the wide-brimmed hat his mother had insisted he bring. The landscape around him had transformed from pine-covered rim to desert scrubland, and the walls seemed to close in as he ventured deeper. He had planned his route carefully, intending to reach a secluded area known as Hermit Creek by evening. The location offered reliable water and established camping sites, while being far enough from the main trails to provide the solitude he craved. According to his research, few people ventured to this area during late September, as the summer tourist season was winding down. The young man stopped frequently to hydrate and read from his Bible, finding particular comfort in the Psalms. Psalm 139 spoke to him powerfully in this environment. "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." As he hiked, Marcus reflected on his childhood and the weight of family legacy. The Thompson family had been pillars of their community for generations. His great-grandfather had been among the first black ministers in Detroit during the Great Migration, helping newly arrived families from the South establish themselves in the industrial North. His grandfather had expanded the ministry during the Civil Rights era, using the church as a headquarters for community organizing and social justice work. His father, Reverend Samuel Thompson, had continued this tradition, building their congregation into one of the most influential in the city. The church ran food banks, after-school programs, job training initiatives, and provided sanctuary for those in need. Marcus had grown up understanding that ministry meant service to community, not just spiritual guidance. But something inside him yearned for a different kind of service. He felt called to conservation work, to protecting God's creation rather than shepherding urban congregations. This desire had created tension within his family, who couldn't understand why he would abandon such a proud tradition for what they saw as a secular pursuit. The trail became more challenging as the afternoon progressed, requiring careful navigation across loose rocks and steep switchbacks. Marcus's physical conditioning served him well. Years of basketball and track in high school, followed by regular workouts during seminary, had prepared him for the demands of canyon hiking. As evening approached, he reached a junction where the established trail branched toward Hermit Creek. However, his map showed an unmarked path that led to an even more remote area deeper in the canyon. The temptation to explore this uncharted territory was strong. He had come seeking solitude and spiritual clarity, and this path promised both in abundance. After consulting his compass and checking his supplies, Marcus made the decision to take the unmarked route. He had enough food and water for several days, and the weather forecast had been favorable. The path appeared well-worn, suggesting that others had traveled this way before, even if it wasn't officially maintained. The unmarked trail proved more challenging than expected, winding through narrow passages between towering rock formations. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that filled Marcus with awe. The play of light and shadow on the ancient stone created an almost mystical environment. As darkness began to fall, he found a sheltered alcove beside a small spring. The location seemed perfect for camping, protected from wind, with fresh water available, and offering a clear view of the star-filled sky above. He set up his tent and prepared a simple meal, feeling more at peace than he had in months. The silence was absolute, except for the gentle trickle of the spring and the distant call of a great horned owl. Marcus opened his Bible by flashlight and read from the book of Job, finding new meaning in the passages about God's power revealed through creation. The words seemed to come alive in this primitive setting, speaking to him with clarity he had never experienced in the classroom or pulpit. Marcus awoke before dawn to the sound of wind howling through the canyon. The peaceful conditions of the previous evening had given way to an unexpected storm system moving through the region. His tent strained against sudden gusts, and he could hear debris rattling against the canyon walls above. Weather in the Grand Canyon was notoriously unpredictable, and Marcus realized he might be facing his first real challenge of the journey. He had checked forecasts before departing, but conditions could change rapidly in this environment. The young man said a prayer for safety and began assessing his situation. The spring that had seemed so inviting the night before was now running muddy from runoff somewhere upstream. His water bottles were full, but he would need to be more conservative with consumption if the spring remained contaminated. The narrow walls that had provided shelter now seemed confining, and he wondered if he should attempt to return to the main trail. As daylight gradually illuminated the canyon, Marcus could see that the storm was more severe than initially apparent. Dark clouds obscured the rim above, and intermittent rain began to fall. In the desert environment, flash floods were a constant danger, and he knew that washes could fill with deadly speed during storms. He spent the morning in his tent reading scripture and praying for guidance. The book of Exodus spoke to him powerfully, particularly the passages about Moses leading the Israelites through the wilderness. Like those ancient travelers, Marcus felt tested by the environment, forced to rely on faith when circumstances seemed uncertain. The storm intensified throughout the day, with periods of heavy rain alternating with howling wind. Marcus's tent held secure, but he began to worry about the possibility of flash flooding in the narrow canyon. He had chosen his campsite carefully, on elevated ground above the streambed, but the volume of water cascading from the walls above was increasing steadily. By afternoon, the decision was made for him. The narrow passage he had used to reach this location was now running with several feet of fast-moving water. Even if the rain stopped immediately, it would be hours before the water receded enough for safe travel. Marcus was effectively trapped until conditions improved. The young man found himself facing exactly the kind of trial he had come seeking, though not in the form he had expected. This was his wilderness testing, his 40 days in the desert compressed into what might be several difficult days of waiting and praying. He opened his Bible to the Gospel of Matthew, reading about Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. As evening approached, the storm showed no signs of abating. Marcus rationed his food carefully and used his water purification tablets to treat some of the clearer runoff he was able to collect. His seminary training had included courses on practical theology, and he found himself applying those lessons in ways his professors had never intended. The isolation was complete now. Even if he had brought a cell phone, which he had deliberately chosen not to do, there would be no signal in this remote location. He was entirely dependent on his own resources and his faith in God's protection. This was the kind of experience that the Desert Fathers had sought, the complete abandonment to divine providence. Throughout the night, Marcus alternated between prayer and fitful sleep. The sound of rushing water and wind created an otherworldly symphony that seemed to speak of forces far greater than human understanding. He felt simultaneously vulnerable and protected, aware of his mortality while trusting in something greater than himself. When morning came, the storm had finally begun to clear, but the damage was extensive. The narrow passage remained flooded, and debris scattered throughout the canyon told the story of flash floods that had swept through during the night. Marcus realized he might be trapped for several more days while waiting for conditions to improve enough for safe travel. The third day brought clear skies and renewed hope. Marcus emerged from his tent to find a transformed landscape. The storm had carved new channels in the sandy floor of the canyon, deposited massive boulders in previously clear passages, and left behind pools of crystal-clear water in natural rock basins. The very geography had been altered by forces beyond human control. As he surveyed the scene, Marcus felt a profound sense of witnessing creation in action. This was geology in real time, the same processes that had carved the Grand Canyon operating on a scale he could observe and comprehend. The storm that had seemed so threatening had actually been part of the ongoing work of shaping the earth. The water in the passage had receded enough to attempt travel, but Marcus decided to remain in place for another day. His food supplies were adequate. The spring was running clear again, and he felt that his spiritual work in this place was not yet complete. The storm had been a test, but perhaps there was still more to learn from this profound solitude. He spent the morning exploring the immediate area, discovering features that had been hidden during his hurried arrival. Ancient petroglyphs marked certain rocks, left by indigenous peoples who had considered this canyon sacred long before European exploration. The images spoke of a deep connection between humans and the natural world, a relationship that Marcus felt he was beginning to understand. His Bible reading took on new dimensions in this environment. The creation stories in Genesis seemed less metaphorical and more literally true when surrounded by evidence of vast geological time. The Psalms that praised God's creation felt like they had been written specifically for this place. Even the challenging passages about suffering and testing resonated with his recent experience of the storm. Marcus found himself praying differently than ever before. In church, prayer had been formal and structured, following traditional patterns learned in seminary. Here, his communion with God felt more immediate and personal. He prayed with his whole body, stretching his arms toward the canyon walls, kneeling beside pools of clear water, lying on his back to contemplate the narrow strip of sky visible above. The silence was no longer complete emptiness, but seemed filled with presence. Every sound, the drip of water from rocks, the call of a canyon wren, the rustle of wind through sparse vegetation, carried meaning. Marcus began to understand why so many religious traditions emphasized wilderness experiences as essential for spiritual growth. As the day progressed, he felt a growing certainty about his calling. The tension he had felt between traditional ministry and environmental stewardship began to resolve itself. He realized that protecting God's creation could be as much a ministry as pastoring a congregation. The earth itself was a sacred text that needed preserving for future generations to read. The young man spent hours writing in his journal, recording not only the events of his journey, but his evolving understanding of faith and purpose. His grandfather's Bible lay open beside him, its pages weighted down with small stones against the desert breeze. The handwritten notes in the margins, accumulated over generations of Thompson men, seemed to offer new insights in this setting. By evening, Marcus felt a peace he had never experienced before. The questions that had driven him to seek solitude were finding answers, though not necessarily the ones he had expected. His calling might indeed be different from his father's, but it was no less valid or important. God's creation needed shepherds just as much as human congregations did. He prepared what he intended to be his final meal in the canyon, planning to begin the journey back to the rim the following morning. The passage appeared clear enough for safe travel, and he felt ready to return to the world with new understanding of his purpose. As darkness fell, he opened his Bible one last time, reading by flashlight the words that had guided his family for generations. Dawn of the fourth day broke clear and calm, with perfect conditions for the journey back to the rim. Marcus had packed his gear carefully, leaving the campsite as pristine as he had found it, following the leave-no-trace principles he had learned. His plan was to retrace his route to the main trail, then ascend to the south rim, where he would call his family to report his safe return. The young man felt transformed by his wilderness experience. The questions about his calling had found resolution in an unexpected synthesis of traditional ministry and environmental stewardship. He envisioned a future where he might serve as a chaplain for the National Park Service, or perhaps establish a ministry focused on creation care and environmental justice. His journal contained pages of revelations and insights that had come during hours of prayer and meditation. The storm had been a crucible that burned away his doubts and refined his sense of purpose. He looked forward to sharing these discoveries with his father, whom he now understood would be proud of any path that involved genuine service to God. The passage that had been flooded during the storm was now easily navigable, though scattered debris testified to the power of the flash flood that had trapped him. Marcus picked his way carefully across the rocky streambed, grateful for his hiking boots and trekking poles. The morning air was crisp, and his spirits were high. As he walked, Marcus reflected on the past few days with gratitude. The isolation had been challenging but ultimately rewarding. He had faced his fears, tested his faith, and emerged with greater confidence in God's plan for his life. The storm that had seemed like a disaster had actually been a blessing in disguise, forcing him to rely completely on divine providence. The familiar junction where the unmarked path met the established trail came into view around midday. Marcus paused there for a final prayer of thanksgiving before rejoining the route that would take him back to civilization. He opened his grandfather's Bible one last time, reading from Psalm 121. "I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." The words seemed particularly appropriate as he gazed up at the towering canyon walls that had sheltered and tested him. This place would always hold special significance in his spiritual journey, a sacred space where he had encountered God in creation and discovered his true calling. Marcus secured the Bible carefully in his backpack and shouldered his pack for the long climb ahead. The ascent to the rim would be strenuous, but he felt strong and ready for the challenge. His water bottles were full, he had adequate food for the journey, and the weather conditions were ideal. What happened next remains one of the Grand Canyon's enduring mysteries. Despite favorable conditions, careful preparation, and Marcus's demonstrated hiking ability, he simply vanished somewhere between that junction and the south rim. No witness reported seeing him on the trail, no distress signals were detected, no evidence of an accident or animal encounter was ever found. The only trace of Marcus Thompson ever discovered was his grandfather's leather Bible, found 3 days later by a park maintenance crew in a location that made no logical sense. The book was resting on a flat rock formation nearly a mile from any established trail, in an area so remote and difficult to access that even experienced canyon guides rarely ventured there. The Bible was undamaged, its pages dry despite recent rains. It lay open to Psalm 139, the same passage that had spoken to Marcus so powerfully during his descent into the canyon days earlier. The handwritten notes from 3 generations of Thompson men were clearly visible, along with fresh writing in Marcus's distinctive script, but the final entry was incomplete, ending mid-sentence. Park rangers found no footprints leading to or from the location where the Bible was discovered. No camping gear, clothing, or other personal items were ever recovered. An extensive search involving helicopters, ground teams, and tracking dogs failed to find any trace of the missing seminary student. The disappearance of Marcus Thompson became one of the Grand Canyon's most perplexing unsolved cases. The National Park Service launched the most extensive search and rescue operation in the canyon's history, involving hundreds of volunteers, professional search teams, and advanced technology. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras scanned every accessible area. Ground teams explored remote passages and hidden alcoves. Expert trackers examined every inch of the trails Marcus might have used. Reverend Samuel Thompson arrived from Detroit within hours of being notified that his son had failed to check in as promised. The normally composed minister was devastated by the news, but he refused to give up hope. He coordinated with park officials, organized prayer vigils, and personally participated in search efforts, despite the physical demands of canyon hiking. "My son is a careful, intelligent young man," Reverend Thompson told reporters. "He would not have taken unnecessary risks. If he's still in that canyon, we'll find him. If God has called him home, then we must trust in his plan, but we won't stop looking until we know the truth." The Thompson family's ordeal became a national news story, touching hearts across the country. The image of a young black seminary student seeking God in the wilderness resonated with people of all backgrounds. Churches throughout America held prayer services for Marcus's safe return. Donations poured in to support the search efforts. Mrs. Thompson, Marcus's mother, never recovered from the trauma of not knowing her son's fate. She refused to hold a memorial service without a body, maintaining hope that Marcus would someday walk through their front door in Detroit. She kept his room exactly as he had left it, his seminary books stacked on the desk, his running shoes by the bed. The discovery of the Bible only deepened the mystery. Experts analyzed the location where it was found, trying to determine how it could have reached such an inaccessible spot. The rock formation was surrounded by sheer drops and required technical climbing skills to access safely. Even if Marcus had somehow reached that location, it made no sense that he would leave behind the most precious item he carried. The incomplete journal entry found in the Bible's margins became the subject of intense speculation. Written in Marcus's handwriting, it read, "I understand now what Grandfather meant about hearing God's voice in creation. The canyon speaks of eternity and our place in something vast beyond human comprehension. Tomorrow, I return to share this revelation, but I feel as though I'm leaving part of my soul in this sacred—" The sentence ended there, with no indication of what had interrupted his writing. Handwriting experts confirmed the entry was authentic and appeared to have been written shortly before Marcus's disappearance. The ink showed no signs of weathering that would suggest the book had been exposed to elements for an extended period. Years passed without answers. The case file remained open, and park rangers continued to watch for any sign of the missing seminarian. Occasionally, hikers would report finding pieces of equipment in remote areas, raising hopes that finally had to be dashed when the items proved unconnected to Marcus Thompson. The mystery took on an almost mythical quality among Grand Canyon visitors and staff. Some believed Marcus had discovered a hidden passage and was living as a hermit in some unexplored corner of the canyon. Others suspected he had suffered an accident in a location so remote that his remains would never be found. A few whispered that he had been taken by supernatural forces, transformed into something beyond human understanding. Reverend Thompson continued his ministry in Detroit, but the loss changed him profoundly. His sermons took on new depth as he wrestled publicly with questions of faith in the face of inexplicable tragedy. The congregation that had known him as a pillar of certainty now saw him as a man struggling honestly with doubt and hope in equal measure. "My son went into the wilderness seeking God," he would tell his congregation. "Perhaps he found what he was looking for in ways we cannot understand." We may never know the full truth of what happened to Marcus, but his journey reminds us that faith sometimes means accepting mystery as part of God's plan. The leather Bible was eventually returned to the Thompson family, where it took its place in their home as both a treasured heirloom and a painful reminder of unanswered questions. Mrs. Thompson would often sit with the book in her lap, reading the final incomplete entry and wondering what revelation her son had been trying to record. Today, more than 2 decades later, the case of Marcus Thompson remains unsolved. The Grand Canyon keeps its secrets, as it has for millions of years. Somewhere in its vast depths, the answer to one young man's disappearance waits in silence, perhaps to be discovered by future explorers, perhaps to remain forever part of the canyon's eternal mystery. The story of the seminary student who vanished seeking God continues to inspire and haunt those who hear it. It serves as a reminder that some questions may not have answers this side of eternity, and that faith sometimes means trusting in the face of incomprehensible loss. In the end, Marcus Thompson found the solitude he sought, an eternal solitude that transcends human understanding. His legacy lives on in the lives he touched, the questions he raised about calling and purpose, and the reminder that seeking God can lead to journeys from which we may never return unchanged, or return at all. The Grand Canyon stands as it always has, magnificent and mysterious, holding its secrets close while continuing to call seekers into its depths. The young man who had walked into the Grand Canyon seeking God had found a way to touch eternity, even if the precise nature of his journey remained forever shrouded in mystery.